You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. Bob Keane here. I am the outgoing editor of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Going to really miss that job. It was a really cool job to have because we get to work with a lot of cool authors like the ones we have today on our show. Fire Ecology is a journal that is run by Springer, but is overseen by the Association for Fire Ecology, and they appoint the editor. And we've got a new one coming in, Jeff Kane. Can't wait to see and work with him. But first, let's talk about a wicked cool paper that we just published. The title of the paper is Prescribed Fire Drives Divergent Invasive Annual Grass Responses in a Dry Forest Mosaic Landscape. And today we have two of the authors, Claire and Alison, here. Welcome, Claire and Alison. Claire, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Bob. I'm excited to be here. I'm Claire Tortorelli, and I did this work while I was a graduate student at OSU. And since then, I've worked for UC Davis and the Forest Service, and I'm now at the BLM.
Well, welcome aboard, Claire, to the Fire Ecology train. And how about you, Alison?
Good morning, this is Alison Dean. Recently retired, but at the time of this study, I was the Fire Effects Monitoring Coordinator for Central Oregon Fire Management Service, which included the Ochiko National Forest, where the burn was, as well as Deschutes Forest and Prineville BLM.
Very cool. Well, this is a really cool paper, and not to give away anything, but Claire, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this work. This project really came to us as a new invasive grass species was found in eastern Oregon and the inland Northwest that was changing fire regimes. And so we got a lot of concerns from firefighters and managers on the ground that saw this grass in this new environment in these open forests, these gaps within forests. And they said, wow, this grass is really changing how fire is spreading across the landscape. And we don't know how to manage it because it's brand new and we need to know more. And so that's really the impetus for this larger work. And this is one small piece that was really tackling this primary concern. How can we manage forests for resistance and resilience to disturbances like fire through the tools we have, which in a lot of cases are prescribed burning and thinning, when we know that in some cases those can make invasive grasses worse? This study really addressed that in a forested environment where we sometimes don't think about invasive grasses as being a big concern. We often think about them being really problematic in rangelands, but we have them in forests too. And so we implemented this study to ask, how are they responding to prescribed burns? Could it be used to help maybe control the invasion, or is it going to lead to more spread?
I think about invasive grasses all the time, so this is a really important paper for me. Alison, giving us an idea what the inspiration was for the study.
As Claire alluded to, it started with a couple of the managers and some of the fire staff on the Ochiko who had already witnessed some changing fire behavior in wildfires where bent nada had started to move into areas where previously these sort of rocky sagebrush flats were acting as control features, and now they're not. So they really wanted to know how this was going to affect prescribed burns and what they were going to get afterwards. And it helped that we had a really great relationship between the resource people, the fire people, and then myself as a semi-researcher, where they got a hold of me well into the planning stage and said, hey, this is coming up in the next year or two. What do you think we can learn from this? Could you put in a few plots? And I thought, well, great opportunity. So I went out, put in control plots as well as ones that were going to be treated, and then got a hold of Becky Kearns over at Pacific Northwest Research Station and said, what protocols should I use that are going to be best for studying this? So she and I collaborated. And then after we had the initial round of pre-treatment monitoring done, we got a hold of Claire and Meg and said, hey, can you guys come in and do you want to do the follow-up? So it was an awesome collaboration from management and research.
There are several things that I read that are really important about the methods of the study. Could you describe a little in detail? I think the listeners would want to hear.
So we set up plots that were line point intercept transects, where we were looking at all of the species that were out there so that we were able to track interactions between the invasive grasses and other species and canopy cover and see how each aspect of that environment was changing with respect to the burn treatment, as well as unburned parts of the area that were within the treatment overall, the 1,500 acres. And then we had also set up some unburned controls outside the burn, but we ended up being able to use just the ones within the treatment area. Any prescribed burn is going to take multiple years of planning. This one, about halfway into the planning, a couple of years in, I was brought in. And so I was able to start the project, and then we were able to track it for 5 years following. And the 1,500 acre burn unit is quite a bit larger than most burns, and it allowed us latitude to do a lot of plots and really get a lot of variety in what we were looking at and make sure that we were capturing as much as we could.
Yeah, it certainly did. So Claire, why don't you give us a little peek at those results?
Yeah, so we found some really surprising results. We had an inkling of how some of the species might respond to fire. For example, we had many different invasive annual grasses in these forested plots. We had cheatgrass, which many people are familiar with, fire promoter in our western rangelands. We had some field bromes, kind of a variety of other annual bromes. And then we had ventonata, which is this newer invasive annual grass. It's only been really around for about 15, 20 years now, and it's just rapidly expanding across especially eastern Oregon, but even heading east from there. And we found that while cheatgrass increased over time with fire and seemed to be exacerbated by fire, ventonata actually seemed to be reduced a little bit by fire. And this was a little bit surprising because we know that ventonata heavily invades burned areas. But what we found is that ventonata, cheatgrass, and those other annual bromes were increasing rapidly across this 5-year study with and without fire. So all species were doubling in cover over just a few years, whether or not they were burning. But in some cases, burning actually tamped down ventonata a little bit. I think what's really important to note is that these areas typically had really open canopies. So this isn't a case where fire was coming in and releasing that canopy and adding light to the understory, in which case we would expect to see annual grasses really taking off. But maybe if you can do a burn and keep a little bit of canopy intact, maybe that's going to reduce your ventonata populations in some cases. Not by too much, and they're going to increase over time either way, but it could be that at least that burn isn't really promoting invasion.
Well, that is good news and bad news. What does all this mean to the manager, Alison?
Well, what Claire just pointed out was really key, that what we saw as far as the grasses were expanding rapidly in both the burned and the unburned areas lets us know that we should not curtail burning just because there's some invasion of ventonata. We can go ahead and plan our burns and carry them out, and certainly use some caution with how we're conducting them so we're not increasing exposure to sunlight with not losing any canopy cover. But this is letting us know that we don't need to put the brakes on just because we've already got some ventonata in the unit, and that in fact treating areas is going to help us control the spread, because if we can make sure that they don't burn under really hot summer conditions in wildfire, that's going to put us ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's a great point. The take-home message of the entire paper is don't let fire be the villain here. It's going to be the hero in the end. So Claire, have you got anything else to add?
I think this is such a cool study. And I think one of the really neat things we were able to capture too is how successful this fire was in preventing the spread of invasives, at least for ventonata. And one thing they did in this study was they actually avoided putting ignitions in areas where they had heavy invasion. So in these forest openings that were more of these sagebrush, shrubby flats that Allie mentioned earlier, those areas were the most heavily invaded. Working with Allie and people that knew this grass was an issue, I said, let's try to avoid ignitions there and really focus our ignitions in the forest where we have more canopy. And I think that was such a success because when you get fire in these invaded areas, you're going to lose that sagebrush, that shrubby component. Those are really important species for wildlife, and we don't want to lose those. So I think like fire in the forest is great where we can keep canopy intact, and avoiding fire in heavily invaded areas where you might lose those sagebrush and those keystone species. So this kind of joint effort, I guess, of thinking about your landscape with invasives in mind.
Very good. Well, to wrap it up, Alison, you want to recognize any co-authors and funding agencies?
Absolutely. I'd like to thank Becky Kearns with Pacific Northwest Research Station and Meg Krawchuk with OSU for their contributions. They're great help in putting this together. Also like to thank our funding agencies, the Joint Fire Science Program, the National Science Foundation, the Oregon Native Plant Society, and the Association for Fire Ecology.
I would also like to thank Meg Krawchuk and Becky Kearns for being some of the best associate editors that the journal has. And I'm so glad they were co-authors on this paper. It was very good to have both of you to talk about this interesting paper today. Thank you for your time. And if anybody out there, all you listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast and want to read the paper, guess what? You can download it for free. Yep, for free. Because Claire and her cast of characters have already paid the freight for you to go ahead and read the paper. So please, if you're interested, download it from our website. And how about tuning into the next Fire Ecology Chats?
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. fireecology.org.